record, and welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, The Hand of Adonai series, Who is Harrison Sawyer, Heart Song, and a bunch of others.
And I am Tessa Emily Hall, and I write young adult fiction and nonfiction, and I am an associate agent and also a YA acquisitions editor.
And with us again is Tina Yeager. Tina, welcome back.
Thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. You have a book that just came out, correct?
It's called Beautiful Warrior, Finding Victory Over the Lies Formed Against You. It's not a fiction book, but it is out with New Hope Publishers.
And you do have several fiction works that you're currently shopping and all of that. So
Yes.
I've read your stuff, and a lot of very quality writing. So
Thank you.
yeah. Today we are going to be looking at how to create a scene sketch. What do we include in a scene? This is one of the more challenging aspects of writing, and a lot of people, especially new writers, really struggle with knowing what should go in a scene. I don't know if you've ever had the experience where you write something and then you're like, do I even need this here? Is it doing anything for me? So Tessa, this was your idea for a topic. When you're talking about a scene sketch, let's just kind of start with a broad stroke. How do you define a scene?
Yeah, so a scene is basically a component of your story. It's a segment of your story that pushes the plot further and also helps to unveil characterization and that sort of thing. So that's pretty much what a scene is.
Okay. And what types of things go into a scene? Like how do we know, like, what's necessary for a scene to be a scene?
Yeah. So basically a scene sketch is something, I learned this from the My Book Therapy, which I mentioned them a lot. But they've helped me to understand how to write scenes that I'm not going to delete later on, scenes that actually have a purpose. And so this is basically the purpose of a scene sketch is to put together the framework of the story's, the scene's construction that will help to guide you as you write the scene. And this basically includes like the scene goal and the point of view of the scene emotion, and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm wondering, are you more of a Tessa, are you more of a discovery writer or more of an outliner?
So I think naturally I've always been more of a discovery writer. But because of that, I would write my first drafts and realize that I really need to work on the plot of the story, and I would throw away a bunch of scenes. So really understanding how to, before I write my book, how to plan the story ahead of time and how to plan the plot arc, the character arc, and also the scenes before I write, to make sure that the scene is going to fit into the big picture of the story. That's just really helped me to be able to write faster. And of course, you can still be a discovery writer even if you use this method, but you're going to write a book that you're less likely to have to throw away and less likely to throw away the scenes that you write. So this has really been beneficial for me as a pantser.
Mm. So Tina, in terms of your fiction, are you discovery or are you more of an outliner?
I've never heard it called discovery, but I like that because I get bored if I know too much about the story. I want to find out what's going on along with the reader. I do find that, like Tessa said, that you end up editing more if you're writing what I like to call organically, because it feels like if you have your character and you know your character and you as a writer are immersed in them, the scenes sort of grow organically around them and the tension grows. You kind of know a little bit about what might happen. However, you do need to kind of learn to plot a little bit as an organic writer. It helps because then you have less editing to do later.
Tina, how much time do you spend kind of preparing and planning for your scenes? Just like typically, I know some scenes you're going to do more and some scenes you're going to do less, but do you kind of have like an amount of time that you spend kind of developing a scene before you actually start writing?
No. I kind of have like a sort of an arc line that I'm going to follow. I know where I want them to maybe get to in the middle of the story and at the end of the story, and then the scenes sort of have to build toward that. So if I know too much about it, I'm not discovering it inside my character as much. So I kind of enter the scene with them. and find out what they're going to do as it happens. Again, you have to edit for it when you do it that way.
Yeah. And that's where I find myself as well. I do very little bit of planning for scenes. And we'll talk about some of the, like exactly what I do and probably what I should be doing. But like you say, Tina, it's, I've got a beginning in mind, and I've got roughly an end in mind on how the story needs to progress, and then I try and surprise myself somewhere in the middle. But that's about all I have. And I will say that working with my editors, there have been several scenes where my editor has had to say, "Look, Aaron, what are we doing here? Like, it's you just kind of spinning your wheels." And I'm like, "Yeah, I know, but it's fun to spin those wheels." He's like, "Yeah, not moving the story. You gotta part with it." So there have been several times I've done that. Tessa, are you still kind of discovery, or are you moving a little bit more toward a kind of an intentional, at least scene outline before you begin?
Yeah, I like to kind of do a combination of both. So I've noticed that whenever I start to write a scene, I can become very confused as to where the scene is going, what's the purpose of it, and it also takes me a lot longer to write. But now that I've started using these scene sketches, I have something to draw from. I know what needs to be included within that scene, and it really helps me to write the scene a lot faster. So I'm a huge fan of this, and actually I like to call it a writer's palette because it's sort of similar to an artist's palette, or where I'll just put together the scene sketch beforehand, and then as I write, I'll dabble in the palette and use some of the colors that I've kind of mixed and created beforehand, just to help to write the scene. So I really appreciate learning all this from my book therapy on what to exactly include in these scene sketches.
So if I can, you mentioned a writer's palette. This is a term that I've used often with my AP students in terms of analyzing both fiction and nonfiction. And what we try and do is we try and figure out what, for lack of a better term, what colors they've been painting with. And I use that as kind of a metaphor to describe what stylistically, what devices they're using. Is it a lot of figurative language? If so, how is the figurative language working? Is it a particular image they keep coming back to? Are they extending this metaphor? Is it a particular voice that they've established? Is it some sort of parallel structure that they're kind of hammering on? Is it their structure? So that's kind of how I use it. How are you using it when you say kind of the author's palette? Do the colors represent just like tools, or does it represent like actual colors in terms of imagery?
It's really just the elements that need to be included in the scene. I just like the comparison because it's something that I gather beforehand, and then I'll use it as I write. So for me, I write using Scrivener, and I'll put together my scene sketch in the document notes. And this really helps me. It even sparks ideas for the scene, and it helps me to really enter into the zone before I actually write the scene. So basically, in the scene sketch, and again, this is from my book therapy, you will want to include who the point of view character is for this scene. So identify that on the scene sketch, and also answer the 5 W questions. So when, where, who, what, why, and I don't think you really need how. And then also the one emotion that you want to portray throughout the scene. And then also 5 senses. So sometimes it's hard to remember to include senses as you write, but if you can gather all this beforehand, if you can just close your eyes and imagine the scene, visualize the scene, walk through the scene beforehand, then write down all the different senses that you're exposed to as that character, then you'll have it right there to pull from as you write your book, and you'll remember that you need to include these. And you don't have to include all the senses, but just as much as you can to really create that kind of experience for the reader, to feel like they're right there with the character. And then as you put together the sensory details, keep that one emotion in mind that you want to portray throughout the scene. And then I'll also gather like how I want the reader to be hooked into the scene and how the scene might end. I might include the conflict of the scene, and this is going to be stemmed from that character's goal. So really, there's two types of scenes, active and reaction scenes. That's what I like to base my scenes off of, are these two types of scenes. So action scene, the character has a goal and motivation for that goal and conflict. So I will include that in my scene sketch. If it's a reaction scene, this means that they're reacting to the action scene that just occurred. So reaction to whatever disaster just happened. And then they have to make a new decision based on that. So this is all stuff that I will gather beforehand and really help me to stay on track as I write that specific scene, to make sure that it's going to fit into the big picture of the story. And it just helps me to get in the zone too, and to brainstorm new ideas for the book.
I like that.
Yeah, I like the intentionality of it. And it to me, it sounds like you could put together a pretty easy outline of whose point of view am I in, what are the 5 senses that I'm going to focus on, what are the 5 W's, what's the primary emotion, what's the hook, how does it begin, what's the cliffhanger, how does it end, what's the goal, is it action, is it reaction. One of the things that's really interesting, tension and conflict, obviously, because every scene needs to have some sort of tension or conflict. Oh man, I just completely lost my... Scrivener you mentioned. And
Yes.
what's great about Scrivener is you can actually color code your scenes.
Yes, I love that.
Yeah, so I color code by point of view, but I could also see if you're only writing from one point of view, if you're writing in first person, you could color code action scenes versus reaction scenes.
Oh yeah, good.
And then what happens is you can just see on the left side very clearly in your folder, oh, I've been in this person's point of view too much. I've done too much action. I need more reaction.
I want to have to use that.
Yeah,
I like that. I usually color code based on what draft of the scene that I'm in, because I don't always I'm not always coherent when it comes to my drafts. Sometimes one draft of a scene will be further along, and then one will be more of a first draft or whatever. So that's how I usually use the color coding, but that's a really good idea. I might have to try that.
Yeah. So Tina, when you're putting your scenes together, you kind of have a vague idea of what's going to be happening. Are these the things that you're thinking about, or do you find that you tend to favor one more than other when you're not outlining?
I kind of naturally think about the senses because I'm more of a poetic sort of writer. That's how I perceive things. So, but I love that this is so, it's intentional without feeling so structured it's strangling. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you could use it as an organic writer without feeling constricted to being a plotter all of a sudden. So I love that it's kind of flexible, and I really love Tessa's imagery of using an artist palette, because that's also very flexible. And you can, as an artist, when you're painting on a canvas, you can paint one part and then go back and paint over and adjust and readjust and change that scene until the scene on your canvas or on your paper becomes something that's as beautiful and vivid as you really intended with each draft. So this is something you could apply in layers, just like you're doing with a visual art piece, where you do a little bit more emotion, a little bit more sensory information, and you make sure that you go, oh, I need that little detail brush to go back and put the who, what, when, where, and why in this little part of the scene that I missed, or I didn't quite highlight the emotion as much as I meant to, but let me go back with that other long brush and put that back in. So I love that. I love that imagery. That's so helpful for organic writers to be able to swallow that concept of plotter.
Yeah. And sometimes the scene will steer off course in a different direction as you write. But again, it is just helpful to have that basic framework in mind, so that you can, stay on track. And something else too that I've sometimes included in my scene sketch is internal monologue. So sometimes if I'm just struggling getting into my character's head, then I will just sit down and just focus on that internal monologue that I want to happen within that scene. So basically this is her, reacting to whatever's happening. And I'll write all that down. I don't always include that within the scene, but it helps me just to have that sort of portray that connection between the reader and the character, and to make sure that I weave in that internal monologue throughout the scene, because teenagers especially love to connect to that strong voice. So it's sometimes helpful to do that. And also sometimes you can just focus on the dialogue that happens within that scene. So just in that scene sketch, you can write down the back and forth dialogue that's going to happen between characters. And of course, you don't always have to use that, but that might spark inspiration for your scene.
You know, it's funny that you mentioned dialogue, because when I notice when I'm not intentionally planning out my scenes this thoroughly, that there are several scenes that end up being almost all dialogue. And so I'll be writing, and it'll just come kind of naturally. It'll come very quickly, and there's a dialogue, and the dialogue needs to happen to further the story, and blah blah blah. But what has happened is I've neglected that the who, what, where, when, why, how. I've neglected the five senses, and now I just have two people talking in a white room kind of a thing. And so I love being able to have something where I can go and look at it and say, okay, here's where they are. And then kind of like we talked about last time with the idea of the interplay of the setting and the character and maintaining that deep POV. What is the predominant emotion that's going on here? What are they experiencing while this conversation is happening? And it's a good way to kind of get out of just this straight dialogue, just writing a scene just to kind of get things moving. So I do like the intentionality of that for sure. Would you say that I mean, Tessa, do you go to the point where you outline every single scene before you write it? Are you at that point?
I don't think I do every scene, but sometimes I'll be writing a scene and it comes out completely different than what I had planned. Sometimes my complete first drafts they're very rough, and I am just writing to try to discover the story and discover the plot. And then that helps me to actually plot the book. And then I will write another draft that's based on that plot that I kind of created based on discovering. So that's why I'm kind of a planter and a plotter at the same time. They both play off of each other. So whenever I do that first draft, sometimes won't have the scene sketch at all. I'll just write as it comes to me as a way to discover, to get some more ideas for the plot. But then during that next draft, when I'm really focusing on writing the book, not just discovering the book, then that's when I can put together these scene sketches, just to make sure that I stay on track with the scenes and with the overall plot arc.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a writing tool and an editing tool. You can use it as one. So that's really great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, you could take scenes that you've already written and apply this to it and ask, does it hold up to it? That's an interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that would be good for especially pantsers to try that, just to make sure, like a checklist, to make sure they have every component in there.
I would also suggest if you are an outliner, maybe this is one of the things where you can, or maybe you're not, maybe you're a discovery writer, but you're finding that you're like me and writing too many scenes that are just not going to be germane to the novel. Maybe what you do is you take this kind of outline type structure and you do 10 to 15 really necessary scenes, and you can kind of diagram them and you put them out and you lay them out on your plot diagram. So this happens here, this happens up here, this happens up here. Here's going to be my climax. I've done that before where I've written with Who is Harrison Sawyer. I was about 50% of the way through the novel when I realized what the ending was. I jumped to the end, I wrote the ending, and then I came back and finished everything leading up to it because I knew where I was going. And then the denouement came a little bit later. And then once I was able to do that, I could go back through and say, I don't need this scene. I don't need this scene. I do need another scene in here. And so I looked at it kind of after I already had the rough arc established. But this might be able to kind of help someone like me kind of bridge that gap between discovery writing and outlining. I do have a couple things that I want to say. There's a surprise. The first thing is, I said earlier that every scene needs tension and conflict. And I may actually go back on that now, because I think in certain novels where everything, if all we have is going from bad to worse to worse to worse to worse to worse, that's going to be really oppressive for the reader. So, a small little interlude, a quiet moment at home, something where the reader or the protagonist can kind of catch his or her breath, allow the reader to breathe, give them some sort of small victory that can kind of encourage them to keep moving forward. Otherwise, if it's just unrelentingly, if it's a John Steinbeck novel where things start off bad and get worse, that can be really, really tough for a reader to get through. So the scene, I guess every scene needs to have a purpose too. And so for me, it would be, what is the purpose here? I love everything that you have here, but I would also add purpose. Am I increasing the tension? Am I resolving a tension? Am I creating a new tension? And then there should be some sort of balancing act there, because if all you're doing is increasing tension, then we have no hope that anything is ever going to be resolved.
And then your reader experiences adrenaline fatigue. They are so much overloaded with tension that there's only so much that they're going to really connect with in the tension. If you have a scene that's humorous, that's heartwarming in the middle, it gives them a chance to breathe. And then when they hit the tension again, it hits them even harder and they really feel it. So having that up and down is actually more helpful at letting the reader experience more of the tension when you really want to ramp it up.
It helps with the momentum too. If you can just have that balance and give them time to have a breather. And of course, there's still going to be overarching tension throughout the course of the story. So even if that scene is still a breather and doesn't include a lot of tension and conflict, the reader still knows that they can't just put down the book, because they have to figure out, like, is the character going to reach their goal? Are they going to defeat the antagonist and that sort of thing? So there's still that overarching tension, but just having that breather allows them to continue that momentum.
Yeah. You don't resolve all of the tension. You resolve a tension. You resolve not the conflict, but you resolve a conflict. Boy gets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back. I mean, at some point, boy has to get girl, right? At some point, there has to be some sort of hope. And if you ever watch those Hallmark movies, like my wife does all the time, she makes me watch them sometimes too. No, she doesn't. But the idea is, they don't like each other, then they kind of start to like each other, then they like each other, then something bad happens. And then they hate each other again. But then they kind of start liking each other again. But then something else happens and they hate each other again. And then they start to kind of work back together, and then they get married and live happily ever after. But that seems to be the goal. There seems to be a working together, and then a division, and then work back together, and then another division. If we're not working back towards something, if we're not resolving a conflict, not the conflict, but if we're not resolving a conflict, then it does get to be somewhat overwhelming. So that would be another thing that I would add to this, is just, what is the purpose of this scene? Are we resolving a conflict? If so, which one? Or are we introducing a new conflict, or are we intensifying an already existing conflict? Those would be the three things that I think your scenes should be doing. And in fact, there was a scene in one of my Hand of Adonai novels, and my editor said, this is not progressing the plot at all. Why is this scene here? And it wasn't a point, it wasn't like, get rid of it. That's not what she was saying. She was just honestly saying, okay, have you really considered what the purpose of this scene was? And I said, yeah, this is the breather. They need a moment. They laugh at this is where they laugh. Everybody laughs, and we take a breath, and then they go and they fight the monsters. But without that, it was just going to be too much. And so that was one of the things. And then the last thing, I feel like I'm taking too much time. I apologize. About the idea of the hook and the cliffhanger. I think everything needs a hook. It shouldn't be gimmicky though. Don't use gimmicks to try and hook the reader. You hook the reader with good, solid detail and information, rather than trying to be mysterious. So establishing the setting in an interesting way is I think enough of a hook to remind the reader whose point of view we're in, and what's going on. And then with the idea of the cliffhanger, I notice this a lot with beginning writers. They want to end the scene with some sort of massive reveal or mystery, and then they just stop it. So they sit down, Bob, we have to talk. I'm pregnant. And then it's the next chapter, and the next line is, what do you mean you're pregnant? Well, why are we ending a chapter here when the next chapter begins on the next line? That just seems like a strange place to stop. If you're interposing a different character's point of view and you're changing the scene and you're changing, now we're in his point of view, that makes sense. But if it's same character, same point of view, same time, there's really no reason to stop here other than to have this cliffhanger. And to me, that's always felt artificial. And so with cliffhangers, the way that I handle it is you can give them that information, but then I'll typically change perspective and I'll go and tell what's happening in a different different part of the world or whatnot before I come back. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Am I alone in that?
I mean, sometimes it might be necessary to break apart the scene depending on how long it is. Because that's what I have to keep in mind when I'm writing young adult fiction, is that I only give myself a certain amount of words to write a scene and also to write a chapter. So if a chapter is coming to the end and I need, it needs a break, but then the scene is still going to unfold in the next chapter. So I think it depends on the specific scene and the word count and the genre and that sort of thing. But that makes complete sense too. You want it to be natural. You want the conflict to be natural, not to, just tease readers.
Yeah. Tina, do you have how are you feeling with that? Like, is that something that you do, or is that something that you try and avoid?
It depends. I mean, you kind of have to know what's going to work best for your reader. What's going to make your reader still want to read the next chapter and move on and not want to put the book down. But at the same time, you don't want the reader to get mad at you and feel cheated that you cut them off in the middle of something that should have continued. So if it's a natural ending, if you have that many words and you're at a place where she came to the door and knocked on the door and she said, "Come in, I've been expecting you." Mm-hmm. That could be an end of a chapter, even though it's not really the end of the scene. If it needs to be, it's still a cliffhanger, but it's not unnatural, because then you can begin with describing where they're at when they enter the creepy house and she's unexpected.
Right.
I mean, that's kind of cliche, but just as an example.
Right. But that's a good place to switch point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and perspective. Sure.
Right.
Tessa, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say it keeps the pace moving forward too. If you do end, the scene at that point, then the reader is going to, keep reading the next chapter to find out what happens, and they'll be less likely to put the book down. But it is a good point to switch points of views in that time.
Yeah, and I guess part of my concern is I've seen people kind of do in the quest to do the cliffhanger, they'll say something like, "Bob, I have to talk to you, I'm pregnant." And then in the next scene, "What do you mean you're pregnant?" And the next line is, "Just kidding. I just wanted to make sure you were listening." And it's like, wait a minute. No. Like that, that kind of like false conflict. I mean, if you're resorting to that feels very gimmicky to me. So the cliffhangers should come naturally, and I don't like the term cliffhanger, because then I think it puts too much on the reader or the writer, that they start to feel like, oh, I have to come up with something. If you know naturally where your scene ends, that's going to be fine. Good writing is the best cliffhanger ever, because there will still be some sort of conflict that's unresolved at the end of your scene, and the person who's reading your book is going to know, the writing is so strong, I want to continue. They're not going to put the book down. They're going to say, "This is great, I want to continue it."
Right. And just keep questions in your reader's mind. So there should always be, at the end of every scene, a reason for them to keep reading, because they want to find out the answers to these specific questions, or just because of the overarching tension of the book, they have to find out, if the character is going to reach their goal and that sort of thing. So just keep that in mind, that you want your reader to continue reading, and the way that you do that is to keep weaving in that kind of conflict, so they will be itching to know what happens next. You don't want to reach a standstill where they're just getting everything, all their goals, and their life is just boring. If your scenes come across as boring and it's just a reflection of their everyday life, then the reader's most likely going to put down your book once they reach the end of that chapter.
Right.
So.
Yeah, the books I've put down have always been because the writing has not been strong enough to keep me going. So if the writing is strong and if you've got a good purpose for your scene, you know what the purpose is and you know where it is and when it is and why it is, etc., that's going to be very beneficial as well. So we are again up against the clock here. So Tina, any last minute questions, comments, or concerns?
No, I love this. I really appreciate Tessa bringing that to us. I'm looking forward to thinking about that more when I go back through probably my editing process more than my first.
Yeah, and that is something to keep in mind too, is that if you are more of a pantser and you like to discover as you write, then this is something that you can apply to your later drafts as you revise and edit your books, just to make sure you hit every point and that is all woven together throughout the scene, and that you continue to establish the reader in that scene by answering those who, what, when, where, why, and, well, how questions.
Yeah. And I would also say, if you're struggling with this, if this is difficult for you, take a book that you really, really love and pull the scene outline from each of their scenes. So look at their scene and pull it out and see if you can identify each of these.
Good.
You know, and then what you'll start to see is certain writers favor certain things. And maybe they're not doing 100% of this, but they know 100% of it. They may not be stressing it, but they at least innately that things are, that they've thought about these types of things. And so that's, I highly recommend studying as much as you can and kind of approaching the craft as a student. And that's one of the best ways to improve. So
yeah, I like that.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you again to My Book Therapy for inspiring Tessa to inspire us. We appreciate that. And if you're looking for us, you can find Molly Jo at mollyjoreilly.com. You can find Tina at tinayeager.com. You can find Tessa Emily Hall at tessaemilyhall.com. We like to keep things easy here. And I am at aarongansky.com. Drop us a line. Be sure to hit the thumbs up on the YouTube and subscribe to our channel and tell a friend about our content. So thank you so much for listening. And until next time, good writing.